Sincerely hope not.
On that note, I think I'll start the seminar. I think we have quite a good number of participants. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Varun Chokshi, and I am a postdoc in the neuroscience department here at Hopkins. Today, we are going to talk about certain important topics regarding immigration policies in the US. We have very talented group of speakers for you here. I encourage each one of you to ask your questions using the Q&A section. And if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat area. Other attendees can also upvote already existing questions in the Q&A sections. I would highly encourage that rather than asking the same question in a different way. So before taking more time, I will first start by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Courtland Robinson, an associate professor in the Department of International Health with a joint appointment in the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health, and is also a core faculty with the Center for Humanitarian Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His research interests have focused on populations in migration, whether displaced by conflict or natural disaster, or in the context of migrant labor and human trafficking. Today, Courtland will speak about the history of refugee resettlement in the United States. Courtland.
Thank you, Varun, and thanks to everybody for organizing. Welcome to all of you who are joining. I've got about 10 to 15 minutes to cover a bit of material, so I'm going to jump right into this, and we'll have save questions for the end, either right after my talk or after everybody's finished speaking. So we'll talk about international refugee law briefly, U.S. immigration law, U.S. refugee law, and U.S. refugee resettlement, all in 15 minutes. Let's see how it goes. So the core definition from the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, I don't need to go this in detail, but basically there's 5 core reasons why a person may face a well-founded fear of persecution, has crossed an international boundary outside their country of residence or origin, and unable or unwilling to return due to fear of persecution for race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. So there's a 51 convention, 67 protocol. The US is signatory to that, but did not finally ultimately incorporate this language until the Refugee Act of 1980. There were elements that preceded, but that was when it basically aligned. We need to go back to 1790 for the rules of enfranchisement of citizens, naturalization, I should say, and notice the language here, free white persons of good moral character. That's a mouthful, but I think it speaks to the ways in which the definition of who is American started with the basic idea that it is a country for white people. And over time, often at the cost of a great deal of struggle and bloodshed, that has evolved. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first law saying specifically ethnic group by name, ethnic designation would be excluded. Restriction Act of 1924 began to impose more strictures on immigration, fearing Southern and Eastern Europe and Asian migration. And interesting to note, many of the Southern and Eastern European migrants were actually not considered white as a social construct. They were Italians, Southern Europeans, they were Catholics, they were Jews. They were not white, which meant not only that color issue, but white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So it's not just white within a broad construct, but a very narrow construct, which has grown and evolved over time. We've had the Immigration Nationality Act of 52, of 65, which finally discontinued these national origin preferences. And then a Reform and Control Act of 1986, and yet another in 96. That was the last comprehensive immigration reform we've had. We've had a lot of executive orders and attempts since then, but suffice it to say that we are increasingly a country divided over immigration and how to proceed. And I think that has given rise to the state of affairs we're in right now. we'll come back to the Immigration Act of 1965, but catching you up on refugee law, again, in the World War II, post-World War II context, there were a number of ad hoc emergency programs. I won't go into those in detail, but this was not really consistent with the Refugee Convention. They were really ad hoc efforts to protect and resettle numbers of people, specifically Hungarians or other populations fleeing World War II or displaced by World War II and unable to return due to regime change in those countries and needed to be resettled in the United States. Immigration Nationality Act of 65 really began to codify some of the refugee provisions, put in numbers for admission. Interestingly, the restriction was that they must have fled from a communist country or a country in the Middle East. So much as we see now bans on people from the Middle East, the 65 Act said we will prefer people from the Middle East and from communist countries. But entrance was conditional. You could naturalize or adjust status after 2 years if you were did not in some other way compromise your situation by violating a law, engaging in the criminal act or some sort. Refugee Act of 1980, which really governs our laws today, defined the refugee consistent with the UN definition, set numerical limitations subject to annual consultations between the executive branch and Congress, and drew a distinction between people resettled as refugees from abroad, which we'll be focusing on, and those seeking asylum in the United States. I won't get into the asylum issues. There were many complicated, maybe other speakers will delve into that. The admission was provisional, but it allows for adjustment of status after 1 year so that people who are resettled initially as refugees can ultimately naturalize and become US citizens. Also set in place a number of ways in which the State Department and the Department of Health and Human Services, particularly Office of Refugee Resettlement, would coordinate admissions decisions from overseas with services provided once a refugee and her or his family arrived and settled in the US in a particular state. And then there will be federal support as well as state and local support from the government as well as from voluntary agencies to provide, one hopes, for a proper, appropriate, healthy integration into American society, work, education, and so forth. Refugee resettlement, simply put, really looks at three categories for admission. One is compelling humanitarian need, lots of different categories, P1, P2, particular population groups, which are often designated in the presidential determinations. It doesn't limit admissions to those groups, but it in a sense gives them a kind of a group preference. And again, I won't get into all of the different examples from recent history. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but these are some of the groups that have been resettled in the last few decades since the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980. As the White House and the executive branch consults with Congress. And then there's also a provision for family members of individuals who are granted asylum to follow and join relatives who are already in the United States. And again, I'm moving quickly, so there's lots of details we may need to get into. Here we have just a brief review of some of the different government roles where the US support first of all, vets an application from overseas, admits an individual or family for resettlement as refugees, and then links that family or case to a voluntary resettlement agency, that being a private organization, but states also do resettlement themselves. And you begin to link to health, social services, education, and the like. And again, I won't go into all of the details. Suffice it to say that since really 9/11, we have seen a more extensive vetting process being implemented overseas. So that extreme vetting, as it's sometimes called, is not peculiar to the Trump administration. They have made the vetting even more extreme, I would say. But that extreme vetting or more extensive vetting really came into place since in the aftermath of 9/11. Now let's look at some numbers. And I won't go into all of this, but I think this is a very nice table because it not only gives you numbers over time from 75 to 2019, but it gives you a breakdown by region of origin: Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and you can see both the overall numbers rising and falling depending on a whole variety of factors, as well as composition shifting from privileging or preferencing one particular region over the other. I would draw your attention to the left-hand side of the screen, looking at particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, with the passage of the Refugee Act. This was at the height of the Indo-Chinese refugee exodus, which is where I began my work, working in Washington, advocating for resettlement and refugee protection in camps overseas. We were at one point resettling more than 200,000 a year, 15,000 refugees per month from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Gradually, that population for resettlement purposes declined, and we saw other shifts. The blue in the 90s was post sort of Glasnost perestroika, resettlement of Soviet Jews and others from the Soviet Union. You can see the 1989 US raises quotas on Soviet refugees. And then sort of post-Kosovo, we've had since the 2000s a kind of a mix where post 9/11, there were strictures on refugee admissions from the Middle East, and the US began to shift its attention back toward Asia, and we saw an increase in resettlement of populations from Burma, or now more recently named Myanmar. You will notice the decline, and it's not a coincidence, really since the beginning of the Trump administration. And we'll see here that the blue line showing the annual ceiling, which was set by the presidential determination in consultation with Congress, and the actual. So you have your target and you have your actual, and you see that quite often, and particularly post 9/11, actual numbers coming in well below the ceiling set, but the ceiling itself, having remained fairly stable from about 2002-ish to maybe 2016, began to fall off dramatically with this new administration. And I will summarize these conclusions drawing on a very helpful document from the Migration Policy Institute. We can share that in the chat or send it to you later. But there's great work from Refugees International and many others who are focusing on these changes. But I think it's important to really look at a number of things. First of all, the asylum system as we know it has been fundamentally dismantled. We have seen refugee resettlement reduction from 50,000 in 2017 to 18,000 now. We'd be likely not even to reach that. We've resettled the fewest number of refugees in a single year since the beginning of the modern US resettlement program. Other humanitarian pathways are being narrowed as we speak. Temporary protected status has been terminated for nearly more than 98% of all beneficiaries. And there are, in addition to that, intermittent refugee country-specific bans, ends to various other refugee and parole programs, new requirements that states have to consent to accepting refugees, and closures of refugee resettlement offices. So I would end my comments simply by saying that we have had a long, complicated, but strong bipartisan commitment over many decades to resettlement of refugees and other forms of protection overseas, but refugee resettlement being really the ultimate form in some ways of protection, being fundamentally dismantled. I think we're at the crisis point. I don't know where we will be going in the future. Much of that depends, at least in part and in the short term, on the elections. But we are really at a critical phase, and I hope our other speakers will help elucidate some of the different ways in which that crisis is affecting very vulnerable populations, either in this country, at our borders, or far overseas waiting, hoping for refugee resettlement. Thank you.
Thank you, Cortland. That was really fascinating piece of talk. I would like to ask you one question, which I think is downstream from your from the graph that you showed. That considering the White House's decreasing cap of refugee admissions, are there trends that all these asylum seekers are going to different countries? And if so, which countries? If you can answer briefly.
There's not a brief answer to that. And I don't know if Yale or others might have additional comments. I mean, it is certainly the case that if people can't see a way to get to the United States in any sort of reasonable time frame, they're going to look elsewhere. They're not just going to sit in a camp or just wait and say, I have all my hopes pinned on asylum or resettlement in the United States. So it's very likely that there's been increases elsewhere. That said, it's not clear in the asylum system, and the data are very problematic. It's not going to pick up somebody saying, I was originally living in Libya and I've come now to Germany and I'm seeking asylum only because the US is not offering me resettlement. So the numbers would certainly be likely to be rising in Europe, but they could be changing and rising and falling for lots of other reasons. The simple answer is protection is being constrained, and refugee resettlement as one form of protection is being constrained by the country that was for many, many years the leader. We used to lead the US, the world in resettlement. We used to take more refugees in a single year than all of the rest of the world combined. Canada passed us in 2018. That's not a record. I'm not competing with Canada, but that just goes to show it's a very small number to begin with, and it's much smaller now. So yes, probably people who had been hoping they might stay in the pipeline for refugee resettlement in the US are saying it doesn't look very likely, and let's try our chances elsewhere. On the other hand, they may be watching for things like administration changes, elections, and so forth, to see if there's a possibility to hold on and see if maybe there'll be a better chance and improved opportunities in the future.
Thank you. So now we will move on to our second speaker, Fatima Sanz. She's a policy strategist at World Education Services. Fatima tracks policy changes on the issue of immigrant economic integration at the state and the federal level. She also works closely with partners to advocate for policies aimed at removing barriers to employment for immigrants and refugees. Fatima has a background in international education and local and national policy research. She holds an MPA and an MS Masters in Education in International Education Development from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a BS in International Politics from Georgetown University. Today, Fatima will speak on policies for credentialing and accepting skilled migrants in the US, and how the pandemic has affected that. And she will focus more also on how these things are existing at a more local state level. Fatima.
Thank you, Varun. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction. And thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited to be part of this webinar series. Like Varun said, my name is Fatima Sanz. I am a policy strategist at World Education Services. I am also an immigrant and a former international student. So this is a great place for me to be at. Before I dive in, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about WES and what we do. So Varun is going to share my slides actually, so I'm just going to tell you to stay on this one for a second. So to those of you in the audience who are international students, you may have heard of a WES credential evaluation. You may have even gotten one at some point. Over more than 45 years, WES has provided credential evaluations to nearly 3 million individuals from around the globe. But WES does more than credential evaluations. WES is a nonprofit social enterprise dedicated to helping international students, immigrants, and refugees achieve their educational and workplace goals. At WES, we advocate for integrating skilled immigrants into the workforce in the United States and in Canada. While we also advocate for policies that are friendly towards international students, today I'm going to focus on the barriers to integration that immigrants and refugees face in the US, with a special focus on the barriers to economic integration and economic mobility. We can pass to the next one. Let me give you some context as to why such advocacy efforts are needed in the US. 2019 data tells us that almost 1/5 of the US civilian labor force is foreign-born, yet immigrants and refugees continue to face barriers to economic integration and mobility. We have seen an increase in the education levels of recent immigrants. In fact, 47% of all immigrants that arrived in the last 5 years had a university-level education. Given the recent employment projections that tell us that the US workforce needs workers with higher levels of education and skills, immigrants should be considered an important talent pool. In spite of this, approximately 2.2 million college-educated immigrants are either unemployed or underemployed. And let me just explain underemployment. Someone who is underemployed is someone who is doing work that does not make full use of their skills or abilities. These 2.2 million individuals represent 23% of the total college-educated labor force in the United States. This is the waste of human capital that affects the individuals, of course, the larger US economy, but also each and every one of our communities. As you can see in this slide, the loss of foregone earnings for those who are unemployed or underemployed is substantial. And the number here does not account for the foregone earnings of individuals who could hold the jobs that underemployed immigrants and refugees currently have. I'll move on to the next one. In here, I thought I would just wrap up a little bit the context and the essence of the issue by showing you the underrepresentation of immigrants and refugees in mid to high wage jobs in contrast to the overrepresentation of immigrants and refugees in low wage jobs. I put together some of the statistics that tell us the industries in which immigrants are represented in substantial numbers. I'd like to draw your attention to one of these numbers. Here we see that 16.5% of all healthcare workers in the US are immigrants. But if you take a closer look, you will see that the distribution of immigrants across all healthcare professions is clearly not even. While immigrants and refugees make up 16.5% of all healthcare workers, they also make up 38.5% of all home health aides. This takes us back to my earlier point. Immigrants and refugees play an essential role in our communities and the US workforce. And while we see high rates of participation in the workforce across all sectors, these high rates are not proportionally distributed across the spectrum of professions within each sector. Varun, can you move on to the next one? So now that we've covered the issue, let's look at some of the barriers that cause the discrepancies we just discussed. If we were in the room, I'd probably ask some of you to raise your hand, but since we're not, I'm just gonna make an assumption and say I'm almost certain everyone here has had that cliche encounter with the immigrant waiter or maybe taxi driver who was a doctor, perhaps an engineer back in their country of origin. If not this one, then a similar story. Why is this so common in the immigrant and refugee communities? In other words, what are some of the factors that create barriers to economic integration and mobility for immigrants and refugees? This slide does not provide an exhaustive list, but it is a list of commonly found barriers. These are especially true for recently arrived immigrants and refugees and those who arrive in the US as adults. In the first one here, inadequate recognition of international education is where I'd like to focus. This often means that immigrants and refugees cannot easily pick up their careers where they left off. In some cases, education systems and professional regulations vary so much from country to country that the hurdles almost seem unsurmountable. This is especially true for those with a background in healthcare. And healthcare is just such a hot topic this year, so I'm going to stay on it a little bit. I'll tell you more about the top line barriers that immigrants and refugees with a background in healthcare face. Take, for instance, an internationally trained physician who comes to the US as an immigrant or a refugee after having practiced medicine for 20 years 20 years in their country of origin. This physician, like any other recent US or international medical graduate, will have to take all of the required US medical licensing examinations, or USMLE steps, and apply to match to a US-based residency program, where he or she will start their training as though they did not have 20 years of experience. This is an investment of time and resources that many immigrants and refugees simply cannot afford. Now, this was a hypothetical story, but it's not far from the reality. There are currently 165,000 internationally trained immigrants with health-related undergraduate degrees in the US whose skills are being underutilized. It's important to note that given the aging population in the United States, the shortage of healthcare providers that we faced prior to this pandemic, and the added strains to the healthcare system as a result of the current pandemic, we really cannot afford to ignore this talent pool of internationally trained healthcare workers. In the next slide, I'll continue to explore the issue of immigrant integration through the lens of healthcare. I'm aware that this seminar series has already covered healthcare in terms of access to healthcare services, but I'd like for us to look at it from the workforce perspective. Healthcare has been a headline this year. It has also driven a big part of our policy work at WES. Due to the pandemic, we have seen a momentum and a political will from some states to respond to the threat of COVID-19 by lifting barriers to occupational licensure for internationally trained healthcare workers. As you can see on this map, the governors of Colorado, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nevada, New Jersey, and New York all signed executive orders lifting barriers for internationally trained healthcare workers who wanted to join the fight against COVID-19. Each state had a different approach, but they all had one thing in common. They allowed internationally trained healthcare workers to apply for temporary licenses. I want to highlight that these were temporary licenses because it means those who applied and received the licenses will continue to face barriers to go back to their professions once the threat of the pandemic is not pressing and their temporary licenses are no longer valid. While these executive orders set a good precedent, and we're happy to see it, our work for long-term policy solutions is certainly far from done. If we move on to the next one, here are some more permanent solutions that can get at the barriers we've discussed today. Several states have created work groups to study the barriers faced by immigrants with international credentials. Many of these work groups have focused on healthcare workers due to high barriers of entry to the profession, as well as shortages in the workforce. While each study has provided slightly different recommendations, some of the top line general recommendations have been to create alternative pathways for licensure and to improve access to the licensure process for those who are English language learners. I'd also like to note that just a couple of months ago, Representative John Katko from New York introduced the Improving Opportunities for New Americans Act of 2020 in the US House of Representatives. If this bill passes, so far it's only been introduced, but if it passes, it would mandate a study similar to those that have already been done at the state level, except this one would be broader in scope, meaning it will look at professions other than those in healthcare, and it would look at barriers nationally. While studies are a good way to identify the barriers, or rather confirm the barriers, they're only the first step. Some states have taken more concrete actions. For the sake of time, I'll focus on just one recent bill that was enacted in Colorado. In 2019, Colorado passed a bill that allows internationally trained barbers and cosmetologists to count their international experience towards the required hours of training needed to be eligible for the licensing examination. I'd like to say one thing as a final note. In recent years, the number of licensed professions has multiplied. Nowadays, 1 in 4 jobs in the United States requires an occupational license. Therefore, ensuring that the process to apply and obtain an occupational license takes into account the needs of immigrants and refugees is as important as ever. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you for bringing these important points to our attention. I would like to ask you a question regarding these new proposed rule to remove the duration of status for international students. What are the impacts it will have on the student population in the US and on the universities as well?
Sure. Yeah, so I didn't really cover that in my presentation, but let me just, go off topic a little bit and say, in case the audience maybe has not read the 250-page rule, which, I don't expect anyone to have read, I'll just give you a brief overview. This new rule basically removes duration of status and now replaces it with a finite, like an actual, length that they will determine, the HS will determine on behalf of the individual. That is set to either 2 or 4 years. It depends on your country of origin mainly, and whether that country has had students in the past overstay their visas at a rate higher than 10%, as well as whether your country of origin or your country of birth is in the list of so-called terrorist states. So having said that very, very brief overview of the rule, I'll say that I was an international student here. So I had duration of status on my visa. My visa was longer than my program, and I changed my program while I was here so that it was a year longer than it should have been, because I added another degree while I had already started my studies. This is something that I probably couldn't have done if this rule had been implemented at the time that I was an international student. So it will affect students in that way. They will not be able to change their minds while they're exploring their student careers here. It will also probably deter those who are affected by this more directly, but it might deter just about every international student that is deciding coming to the US or maybe other places for their educational, benefits. It also is a rule that if you look at the list of countries that it targets, it just so happens, coincidentally, one could say, that it targets countries where students, are generally Black and brown. And I don't know, one could say the rule is not very fair while still being nonpartisan, as we discussed at the beginning of this conversation. It will not only affect the students, but it will affect the universities that depend so deeply on the tuition dollars from international students, but also in the cultural and linguistical diversity that international students bring to the universities, but also the university towns. International students, I recently saw create about 500,000 jobs in this country. And those are not only faculty and staff of universities, they're also the towns around the universities that benefit from that economic influx. So without giving you my opinion of the rule, there's an overview of its effects.
Thank you very much. So now we will move on to our final speaker. Dr. Yael Shkasher is Senior US Advocate at Refugees International in Washington, D.C., where she focuses on asylum, refugee admissions, temporary protected status, and humanitarian visas. In recent reports for Refugee International, Yael has addressed the negative impacts of US COVID-19 border and deportation policies and suggested alternative approaches that better respond to public health concerns while upholding the rights of asylum seekers. Prior to joining Refugees International, Yael worked on her forthcoming book about the history of asylum in the United States as a postdoctoral fellow at the University for Historical Studies, at the Institute of Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Before that, she spent several years teaching about immigration at the University of Connecticut and volunteering at Legal Services Office at the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. She has an MA in History and a PhD in American Studies from Harvard University. Today, Yael will speak on mobility or immobility in the time of COVID, globally and in the US. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I was a historian by training, and now I work for Refugees International. And Refugees International is an organization that was founded in 1979, really in response to the Vietnam refugee crisis. But since then, it's focused on many different things, and displacement crisis, forced displacement, and what that means internationally, whether it be through war and conflict, climate displacement, with its gender-based variants, and then in different regions of the world. For a long time, Refugees International did not particularly focus on the United States. The idea sort of was the US had this moral authority, given its traditionally welcoming and large resettlement program. It uses moral authority to push other countries to do better for forcibly displaced people. Things have changed, as we heard from Professor Robinson, and part of me coming to Refugees International was to sort of actually focus attention on the United States and changes in the United States policy, particularly around asylum, which, as you know, is where my research has been in the past. So I was supposed to sort of connect the long history of refugee and asylum policy with foreign student policy and the COVID related changes. So that's a lot. I didn't make slides, but I have a few points I wanna make tying things together. One thing is about the history of foreign student policy in the United States. It's really quite interesting. It really started a long time ago, and its origins were really in the idea of foreign students would come to the United States to study briefly and return to their home countries, and there'd be a lot of benefits to this. It would help US companies who would have now commercial contacts in countries all over the world from the students they have, so it would like be good for trade and commerce. It would be great for foreign policy, because if you had, foreign educated elites from, let's say, the developing world, especially during the Cold War, it would be a good thing to have students go back to their home countries and be allies in the sort of global, both, in terms of capitalism and in terms of American, the American side in the Cold War. And the goal of return was always there, right? You were going to come train here, but bring the skills back. You're going to be basically ambassadors, almost in a way, of American training in your home country. Now, obviously, that didn't work for everybody, especially students who have been in the United States when conflict broke out in their home countries, and they couldn't actually go back. So that brings us to more like asylum seekers. And the difference between a refugee and asylum seeker is that a refugee is somebody who's resettled from overseas, as Professor Robinson discussed. An asylum seeker is somebody who actually makes their way to the United States on their own outside that resettlement system, and then asks to be recognized as a refugee under the same definition that Professor Robinson mentioned about people resettled overseas. Some of these students would be in a foreign student status on a foreign student visa or in an exchange program and would be stuck here in the United States. This happens to Chinese students in the 1950s. It happened to many different, it happens to Nigerian students from Biafra in the 1960s. It happened to people during, from Pakistan, India during the war in the early 1970s. I mean, so students all over the world sort of were here studying and then got stuck here, and accommodations had to be made for those students. They sometimes were given sort of a temporary protected status to stay here and learn. Some students, like the Chinese right after the revolution, were actually given money and scholarships to stay. And I should say that there are other countries, not ours very much, that have programs for refugee students. So Canada has a program for refugee students to come be resettled and sort of come and study in Canada. That's sort of a kind of complementary pathway. So rather than being resettled, right, you would come if you're in a country that was war torn and you didn't have any options to study, say you were in Syria or Yemen, where there's a sort of humanitarian crisis going on, you may be able to get a student visa and a scholarship to study in another country. That would be a kind of refuge. The United States doesn't really have that. During the Hungarian resettlement crisis, refugee system that we had in the 1950s, there was actually a special program for Hungarian students. So there are sometimes these overlap between refugee programs and student programs, but they're kind of ad hoc. And right now it's mostly just private universities that would have a scholarship program for, say, a refugee population. Like I know, like Columbia University, my undergraduate alma mater, has a program for refugee students. They could either be asylum seekers, they could be refugees to study there. It's a scholarship program. The 1970s was really a fulcrum. What ended up happening is that there was two things that happened. First, there was this real concern about overstays. Exactly what Fatima was talking about. You start to see this concern that students are overstaying their visas and people are here illegally, and there's sort of a crackdown on foreign students who overstay their visas. That's what's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, you start to see a realization that many of the students who study in the United States actually should be given a path to stay here permanently in the United States. And that's when, you know, for example, here's a good statistic. In 2015, 30% of science and engineering faculty were foreign-born individuals with doctorates from US schools. So these people had come on student visas, gotten their PhDs in the United States, and then become faculty to actually teach at universities. This is compared to just 12% of faculty in science engineering in 1973. So you see the change. So there's this realization that we need to give some of these people who are on student visas in the United States an ability to actually become the teachers that will train US students in these fields. There was this like need for expertise that the US needed to get from overseas. And this gets to what Fatima was talking about, the kind of contributions that foreign students then make to the US STEM fields, to the economy. And one of the main, I think, problems that we've had, you know, recently is that there's been this overemphasis on this concern about people overstaying and this lack of emphasis on realizing the contributions people are making, right? And that's sort of driving the policy, and this desire to sort of shrink the pathways that foreign students can have toward permanent status here, and instead kind of kick them out and discourage them from even coming to begin with. You know, the duration of status policy that Fatima talked about really, you know, is part of that discouragement scheme. I mean, if you make it difficult for students to get extensions, to actually fulfill their jobs, to actually get into these training programs after they graduate, to sort of pursue a path here, it's not going to make people want to come. And also, you know, just this idea that you have to apply for an extension after 2 years, let's say, if you're from one of these countries that has these big overstayers, which, by the way, the data about overstaying is terrible. Much of it does not take into account people who have actually left. DHS system has to catch up. So the data upon which all these countries are designated as like high overstay countries is problematic to begin with. But okay, be that as it may, even if you happen to now come from the 30, you know, like 30 African countries that are now in that overstay category, think about what that's going to do to the ability of African students to study in the United States. I mean, it's going to make it so it's practically impossible. And, you know, getting an extension right now is extremely difficult because of other things that are going on with our immigration system. We have an extremely backlogged system in the legal immigration system. So if somebody wanted to apply for extension, it may take forever for them to actually get that extension granted. It would cost quite a bit of money. So these are sort of discouraging policies to begin with. And I just want to say that I think this relates to the overall system in the sense that what we've seen with refugee policy and immigration policy in general is this sort of zero-sum idea. It's that if we have to stop foreign students from coming to, and, you know, regularizing their status in the United States because they're literally taking away options for American students. That's literally the way it's framed. So sort of American first, like if you have to see foreign students as actually competitors, direct competitors with US students, and taking away those options, those STEM jobs from, and what we see from the data is that that's actually not true. As Fatima was saying, it's actually their, create jobs. And as I said, they teach US students frequently, so the idea that this is a zero-sum game is not productive. And that is really what has driven, the last thing I'll say is that is really what has driven US asylum and refugee policy as well. So the way it's set up now is that when Secretary Pompeo announces his presidential determination as to how many people will be resettled in the United States, he frequently says something along these lines, or he has the past couple of years, which is, well, we're only going to let in a few thousand refugees instead of tens of thousands of refugees this year because we have so many asylum seekers that we have to deal with at the US southern border. Now, as I said, asylum seekers. Now, that is a disingenuous argument because we are actually not allowing those people to actually seek asylum at the border. And so this idea that we are so generous on asylum, therefore we cannot be generous to refugees resettled, it's just not, it's not an accurate representation of what's happening. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's not asylum seekers versus refugees, just the way it's really presented. And now in terms of sort of the border policies right now under COVID, it's also sort of presented in this like zero-sum way, which is not very helpful, which is this idea that people coming across the border, whether it be the asylum seekers at the southern border, even immigrants from, immigrants from China, students from China, they are a threat. They are a public health threat to our country. And now that seems a little bit strange to say right now because the US, has a lot more cases of COVID, has community spread here. To say that an asylum seeker seeking refuge at the border is going to be a super spreader is a bit disingenuous. And the rule is so broad brushstroke that it doesn't even say, okay, we won't let, for example, sick people in. No, it just says we won't let anybody in. And that I think is also a problem. So the epidemiological data doesn't really support the argument of just these broad ranging, close everything border. It just does not, the data is not there to support it. And the same thing is true with students and foreigners. I mean, we definitely do need, as Professor Robinson noted, we have not had a real reform in our immigration system since 1996. And a lot has changed since then, beyond the security issues with 9/11. Technologically, things have changed. Things have definitely changed in the world of science and technology, probably most of all. And the H-1B system for skilled workers to come to the United States, which is the visa that many foreign students kind of jump to through training. It's not being used very well. So the solution that the administration has is, okay, let's just target everybody on an H-1B visa and say no more. Rather than say, okay, let's figure out how to target employers who are really misusing this system. Let's do a much more fine-tuned kind of reform. And I think that part of the problem is this across the board discouraging zero-sum approach, broad brushstroke approach to policy reform in this space that isn't really backed up by data, by good science, and actually won't accomplish what I think is the goal, which is to help the American economy, help Americans actually, even if that is the ostensible goal. Besides that, it is really, really running roughshod over the human rights of many, many people seeking asylum. We have obligations under international law to allow people to ask for protection, and just suspending them in the name of like an unfounded theory in public health doesn't really make much sense. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take questions on specifics.
Thank you very much. That was a very fabulous talk. You already answered some of the aspect of the question that I'm going to ask you, but what areas of immigration policies currently defy known best practices or research evidence? And do you believe, or how can progress be made on those fronts to make these policies data-driven and research-based?
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I think there's never been a better time for people with backgrounds in STEM to really like engage, because, you know, it's the expertise that really inform, you know, public health. Where public health and immigration intersect, what we really need is people with expertise in both to sort of engage in the policy discussion, and it's very lacking right now. So, so I mentioned border policy already. There's sort of this idea, the CDC put out a rule that basically closed the border to anybody who doesn't have documents. And the ostensible reason for that is that there was this concern for the health of DHS frontline workers at the border, and also the idea that you cannot keep people safely in congregate settings at the border. There's a lot of built-in assumptions there. One is that you need to detain everybody who comes in. And I think probably the policy beyond the border policy, the policy that is most clearly not in line with good public health ideas and human rights, to be perfectly frank, is our immigration detention policy. We detain way beyond what we need. In fact, there are many, many alternatives to detention that would allow for people to sort of go to their immigration hearings and go through the process without recidivism and without absconding and things like this. But they're not used. We rely very much on detention, and what we've seen, I'll just raise this quickly, is that, you know, immigration detention centers like prisons all over the country have become hotspots for COVID-19. So throwing a immigrant or an asylum seeker into prison is not a good idea from a public health perspective, and I don't think it's necessary from either a sort of law enforcement perspective about making sure that people don't disappear in the country, and also from a human rights perspective, because conditions in detention are really, really terrible, and there's really no access to counsel there, and there are other barriers to actually fair procedure in the way the detention system is set up. And I'm sure many people are following the news and have read about conditions in detention, you know, some sort of horror stories that have come out recently, but the idea that they are COVID hotspots, and any epidemiologist will tell you, and I worked with one Johns Hopkins epidemiologist who his name is Chris Byrer, who specifically focuses on how these conditions of detention just become, you know, real hotspots for COVID-19. You don't want, and this is true all over the world. I mean, think about a refugee camp in another country. You asked about mobility earlier in other parts of the world. Think about a refugee camp and the way people are smushed together, don't have access to clean water, don't have access to good hygiene, and how that could also become a hotspot, right, for COVID-19. So there are a lot of places in the world where we need to sort of think about how to deal with COVID effectively, but certainly in the United States, there are certain immigration-related policies that are counterproductive, both in terms of the rights of immigrants and refugees and combating a public health crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you all the speakers for giving us a good crash course and educating our community at Hopkins about immigration policies. Now we'll open the area for general Q&A section. So I will ask initially some questions that attendees had asked during registration. So one question that comes to my mind is what are the current policies regarding asylum seekers or immigrants receiving healthcare in the US?
Yeah, you want to do that?
You can take a stab at it first, and if there's anything I have to add.
Long and complex topic. I think suffice it to say that even under the Affordable Care Act, undocumented migrants were not eligible to receive federal healthcare support, although there were a number of initiatives at the state and local level to which they might have eligibility for services. I'm not sure what I can say in the time that we have, except that healthcare, as Yeo mentioned, is also very much going backwards rapidly in commitments to just basic health and public health of protecting the health of the population, including immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And unfortunately, the dynamic that's been set up, I think quite deliberately by this administration, is to pit one group against the other and to use the public health, the fear of infection as a way of excluding. Again, we've had many laws on the books for many decades that provide waivers, humanitarian waivers for various kinds of excludable conditions. All of these have worked very well to both protect the public health as well as protect the rights and needs of vulnerable people to seek and enjoy asylum, whether that comes by affirmative asylum or defensive asylum or refugee resettlement or all the various other mechanisms. So again, public health is unfortunately being used as a tool. It's being weaponized against immigrant and refugee populations when I think it really can and should be used as a way to protect everybody. And there are many ways in which we've done that over many decades. We used to kind of be a leader in the world and a good model for other countries. And now I'm afraid we're just the opposite.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing on this is that so on the practical matter, so refugees, when they are resettled in the United States, and if you've actually won asylum, you're also entitled to certain benefits, and you can get, federal benefits, but immigrants anybody who's not naturalized in the United States, one of the things that 1996 law did was make even legal immigrants who before they have for their citizens aren't really eligible for many benefits. Obviously, in this country, we have mostly an employment-based healthcare system, which means that a lot of people who have lost their jobs during COVID also lost their health insurance, which is not a good thing. And people who are in the United States who are here in the United States illegally, or who have not yet won asylum, so they're technically not illegal, but they're in the process of applying, so they don't have a status. They also sort of don't have easy access, and if you don't have employment authorization, which is another kind of problem, you have a hard time getting access to healthcare in this country. So there are a lot of healthcare gaps that I think vulnerable populations do face, especially now with problems with the economy. When you have an employment-based healthcare system and you have a crashing economy and a lot of people unemployed, you are going to end up with a lot of healthcare gaps.
Thank you very much. I will ask this next question posted in Q&A section. I really like the question. We talk about a lot of immigration or refugees on the basis of highly skilled and essential jobs like healthcare, but how can we make a case of other employment opportunities like artists or workers outside these canonical capitalism modes of productivity jobs? Why are those stories not appealing to be able to sold for border policies?
I guess I'll take the labor question.
Fatima?
Yeah, so I guess I'll say that we focus our advocacy on what I guess the person is referring to as highly skilled or essential, because there is a structure and there are structural barriers. There are licensing bodies that set certain rules as to who can apply and what sort of credentials they need to provide when they're applying. I'm not sure that the story of immigrant artists doesn't sell as much, but in terms of structural barriers, it isn't maybe as prominent or as rigid of a system to try to enter if you are a an internationally trained artist or an immigrant artist who has experience in that field outside of this country. I honestly haven't done a lot of work in that, so I can't say much about it, but I do know that the structural barriers around other professions that have regulations, because there are public health risks like health, like engineering, like architecture, like dentistry, like teachers, like plumbers, all of these are professions that are regulated. They're very strict. A lot of them have requirements of immigration status that aren't necessarily backed up by any data. You don't have to be a US citizen or a US green card holder to be a good plumber, yet is a requirement in some states. That's why we focus in these essential or highly skilled areas. I don't have a good answer for the rest of the question.
I have one thing to add, which is that I think one of the results of like the zero sum thinking that I talked about earlier was this idea that one of the ways sometimes people make the argument like in favor of immigrants is by saying like, oh, they only do jobs like Americans don't want. Therefore, like that makes it okay because they're not actually competing with immigrants. And I think what that argument actually does is like demean the labor of immigrants, first of all, like, the idea that like you're a farmer, so that's like a job nobody wants, so it like demeans like whole sectors and almost dehumanizes people who do the work in entire sectors of the economy that are essential. Clearly, they're like our food supply, right? So that's one thing. And care work, right? Like the nannies that take care of our children and the people who clean buildings and our offices, those also are sort of like demean jobs, right? It's like, even though essential, like to our economy, food service, hospitality, you know where I'm going with this. But the other thing, I mean, I think that also makes, and I think one of the reasons for licensure laws and one of the reasons historically that certain professional fields have been tightly guarded against immigrants. And this was true in the 1930s. And there was tons of barriers against immigrants who wanted to come in, especially from Europe, who were refugees, basically, wanted to come in and fill professions, and, think about, you all are in academia now. Academia is a pretty tight, hard market for Americans graduating. And so there's this idea that you have to close, especially in the sort of learned professions, and maybe even in the arts, there is a sort of competition there that, again, I don't think is productive. And I think sometimes universities can be on the forefront of saying, look, I think universities have been the biggest advocates for this idea that there's sometimes a global knowledge that needs to be shared. Art is something that's, cross borders. We need to actually learn. Knowledge is best when it's shared and international. Will be as more creative and more knowledge will be produced. So I think since the post-war period, universities have taken that position that it's better to have more people from more countries with access because it will just create a bigger pool of knowledge and artistic creativity.
I have time for one quick comment, more sort of an editorial than a policy recommendation, but I think there is a need, a long overdue and increasingly overdue need for a healthy debate about immigration policy and refugee policy in this country. And we have had those debates over many decades. They're fractious. They pit one group against another. They're often rather heated, but they have gone forward. And since 1996, for a variety of reasons, we haven't had that. And the debate increasingly has not been a debate at all. It's been a sort of a shouting match. And there is a question: what's the proper mix of work-related criteria versus family reunification? What's the proper mix within the work criteria of highly skilled, semi-skilled, low-skilled? What's the right number annually? What's the appropriate mix? And this is getting quite contentious ethnically. Trump famously said, we want more migrants from Norway, and to which Norway replied, we're not coming there. It would be nuts to leave Norway. What are you talking about? So it's racial, and it goes back to the founding of this republic. And I would like to submit that there is a way forward if we commit both to a broader bipartisan conversation. We look at the laws we have on our books and don't try to dismantle them and improve on them. And we try to do this building on the evidence that we have and not jumping sort of radically and randomly into some emotion-driven, ideologically driven, highly weaponized conversation about us versus them. We have thrived as a country because of immigration. We are a nation of immigrants. We're also a nation founded on trafficking and enslavement of Africans and dislocation of Native American peoples. So this is not a wonderful story of how America was formed for Europeans without cost and with only great gains for us as a country and the world. It's a struggle, and we're trying to get it right. I think that's my optimist view, but we're also at a very dark and dangerous place where I think some of those fundamental commitments to sort of bipartisan dialogue on immigration and refugee migration, resettlement, protection globally, as well as in this country, is being weaponized. And unless and until we can get back to a healthy, often spirited and heated debate, I'm afraid we're just going to be seeing more and more of what we've seen in the last few years. It may turn around and it may not in the short term or longer term. But my hope is that we'll get back to some of those basic principles which say we are sort of a gathered people and we do not privilege or prefer one over the other, but we also have to set some kinds of limits because that's the nature of politics. You have to have a managed approach. But that conversation now, as I say, I think has lost the residual bipartisanship that I certainly saw when I came into this work in the 80s, 70s and 80s, even the 90s and 2000s, but it began to change post 9/11, and I think for a variety of reasons, we're moving farther and farther into a really fundamentally partisan approach to these issues as opposed to a broader bipartisan and pluralistic conversation.
I noticed in the chat that there was a question about I think it was directed at one of my statistics about foreign teachers in the United States, about brain drain. That's really interesting. What's interesting about that is brain drain was a very big concern for policymakers in the 1960s. And that was part of the reason why, as I said earlier, this idea was that the United States would train foreign students, but then they would have to go back to their own country so that they could help in development. We didn't want to have all the African doctors come to the United States and stay here when there are certain African countries that lacked that kind of health infrastructure, for example. What's now interesting is that as Fatima, the concern is actually more like brain waste, where like people who come with training can't actually use it. And so there's all this talent that's sort of being wasted in the United States. One of the things I think is, I think this gets at a very, very important issue, which is like when people go abroad to study, should they be forced sort of to go back to their home countries and, contribute? I think this gets to the key issue. Or should they be allowed to sort of just choose what they want to do? And, this is sort of fundamental to me. And I think it's really part of the debate about this mobility. Like you study somewhere. And actually, I think, among African students, what we've seen is, for example, a huge decrease in Africans coming to study in the United States and a huge increase in Africans studying in China. Now, for example, that people are just going someplace else. And the question would be like, are people going to eventually go back home, and what would be the best policy? And and this gets also at the issue of, the United States gives a ton of development aid to other countries that in order to basically pay for healthcare, right? And pay for the things that, to give money to make sure that, doctors can help out. And then we have to figure out how to get, our humanitarian aid policy and our immigration policy, like, coordinated. Because I think it's a good question. Right now we have neither. We neither have a lot of good humanitarian aid policy abroad, and development policy abroad, nor do we have good sort of immigration and refugee policy. But I think that the question is a really good one to think about, you know, how can we address that brain drain or brain waste problem without really forcing people into certain migration paths? Like there needs to be a balance between sort of people deciding what they want to do and country policy really keeping in the best interest of countries in mind, right? And so to me, this is actually where the debate needs to go. And as Cortland said, we haven't been having this discussion at all. We've just sort of like not been talking about that big issue.
Thank you very much. I think we are just at the end time. There are more questions, but I will address them to you separately later. Let's thank our speakers for providing us a really stimulating talk and important questions for this year. Thank you very much. Clap for everyone. And I would like to remind everyone that please join us next week for our next seminar on climate change. That is also an important issue that we will face in our future, at least our future generations. We will have to address those very important questions as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all. Be in touch. Be well. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.